Welcome to this channel, and we are going to talk about the albums that came out in 2021 that we particularly liked.
Yeah, I'm Rylee.
And I'm Brighton. And
Today,
let's start.
We're not. I thought we were gonna go in unison and say our line, but we didn't plan anything. 2021, interesting year for music. I feel like the later you get in music, the more difficult it is to kind of pin down what the trends are, because there's just so much music. Like, I feel like every year since the 60s, there's been just more music exponentially. A lot of genres kind of started or maybe blew up in certain decades, but nowadays it's like more music of each of those genres is being made currently than there ever has been. And so it's kind of hard to say if like that's necessarily the trend.
It must be because of people having more access to recording equipment at their homes or just starting a band, and because of like, either social media or streaming, you can kind of get your music out there more easily without having to like debut it live. So you don't have to follow the exact trend of what's going on to have a chance. You can kind of do your own thing. So people look to like whatever genre they like and make that. It's hard to become like the next really big band. Sometimes maybe you'll have a big song, especially if it catches TikTok or whatever. At the same time, you have many microgenres coming out.
Oh yeah, there are lots, and we'll dive into a few of them in this channel. These albums that we pick may not be the most popular or obvious picks. So if you are like, whoa, I've never heard of this album, and I've been keeping up with music, cool. Check out these albums. Be sure to leave in the comments your own top 5 from the year.
So we'll start with both of our number 5s, so the lowest on the list, but still the top 5 album. So you can start. What was your number 5 of the year?
It's from one of my favorite ambient artists, Lawsil, who is, if I am correct, actually local. Well, we're Canadian, so he's
local enough.
He's local enough, being from Vancouver, right? It's just such a profound album to me. He kind of goes into some of his older sounds, which are a lot more like underwater, submerged, bubbly almost, with like really expansive, emotive pads. This ambient album is just, it captures what I like in ambient music, which is the expressiveness, while not being like too complex, so that you can kind of just like really center in on the layers that are there. And I actually got into this artist and this album in particular by your recommendation.
Music was made from I think it's a 3-minute sample of orchestral music that he kind of like had like performed by an orchestra. And he took that and he like made it into this full album by like modulating it, changing it. So it's basically the same take interpretation on a small piece of really dense music.
That's really cool.
And sometimes you get percussion and pulses that kind of come to make percussion, and those are actually like little record scratches that he like added to the analog like recording that he was using to sample to add like a bit of a rhythm. And also the name Clara is also his daughter's name, but it also means like, I think it's another word for the sun. And kind of, or sun or radiance, something like that. And every track is about that as well. So every track is a different word for radiant, representing light in different ways.
That's cool.
Yeah.
I've listened to this while like meditating often, and with like the moments where they have major pentatonic scales going up, which feels like bubbles rising in the water. I just always feel like I'm like so deeply submerged in water, which is like a really oddly peaceful feeling. So
my number 5 is it's a very hyped album from this year, but I think it just deserves a mention on this list because it's awesome, which is the new, and only Silk Sonic. A collaboration between Anderson .Paak and Bruno Mars, who are both pretty talented and popular artists in their own right, but on this collaboration they kind of are doing this 70s throwback soul project. And it's really fun. It gets a lot of fun. It's a short project, 9 tracks, about 30 minutes, but it's really like they don't waste any time. It's almost like a little bit of a loose concept album in a way. It almost tells the story of like finding some lover, having a bit of a fling, and then finds themselves being used by their partner to like basically buy them expensive things, and then gets cheated on, and then has to kind of keep up public appearances while they're really like feeling terrible, and then eventually starting to blow their money on gambling to try and feel better before kind of getting out of it. It's fun to have in this kind of context as these lyrics, and Bruno Mars is just really good for his whole vocal performance on every song. Not to mention Anderson .Paak's drumming and also his backing vocals sometimes. It's just a good mix. There's a lot of good chemistry. I'll go to our number 4.
Yeah, so my number 4 pick would be the Tiger Cub album, As Blue as Indigo. I was hooked in by the song Beauty. This album is in the genre of modern alternative rock.
It's in the same vein
Yeah.
as like Queens of the Stone Age,
Yeah.
or like, I don't know, Muse even.
Muse or Royal Blood.
Sure.
And I was listening to a bunch of this genre just to see kind of what the trends in modern alternative rock are. And I was very disappointed overall. I felt like a lot of them were just overproduced, the vocals were overcompressed, and just like the general structure of their songs wasn't anything new. It kind of just bored me. But this album, even though it had a lot of those elements in it, I feel like it did all of that like really well. And so yeah, you have a bunch of songs. The opener I feel like is super strong, starting off with a really kind of somber start, and then it kind of all the instruments come in and they continue to do that melody, that same kind of verse throughout the rest of the song for the most part, and yet it just changes the context of it completely. There's lots going into this album, and I think I really get a lot out of it, and I've worked out to or jogged or whatever to these songs a lot, and I feel like they've stood up many listens, so that's good.
That's how I first listened to that album too, was on a workout. It was very fitting for that kind of setting. I don't know.
Yeah.
The songs are all like really good pump up tracks.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. Pretty sure the band is a trio, and I'm pretty sure they're from Brighton as well. So
Really?
Kind of cool.
That's
Yeah.
cool.
Not the only band that we're going to be talking about that's from Brighton, which is kind of fun. So my number 4 is an ambient project, which is I think the best ambient project of the year. And you introduced me to this one while we were just on a call, and it was great. So this is the project by the artist Abu Mogard, and it's called In Immobile Air. Oh, it's about I think a 40-minute album.
It's pretty short.
So it's short, but every track out of the 5 tracks is just like it's an immense, large-scale ambient piece. Every track really has such weight to it, such a sense of, I don't know, impending doom almost. And the soundscape, while very sparse, very minimalistic, every little flavor that's added to the mix just adds so much in terms of just like twisting the mood or adding this sort of layer or depth to the sound.
Mm-hmm.
And you get these like stormy kind of rumbling synths that take minutes to build to their full extent, or you get like the somber piano or something like that,
Mm-hmm.
or just like kind of very lilting, almost like desolate synths. It's such a cool project, and it really evokes like the sense of like deep melancholy, but on like a planetary scale. Like, I really like this ambient album because I feel like I haven't really heard one in a while that captures this kind of sense of like wonder and devastation. So I really like this.
This is one that I like a lot too, but I was not able to include it on the list. I didn't want to also put only ambient albums for this. Ambient music was the main 2021 one for me, just because there's a lot that's always coming out, because it's a really big genre these days. And so I was like, I just want to keep up on it, and if I'm meditating, it's good to just throw something on. So I just had lots of good reason to listen to ambient music. And so yeah, this was one of the ones that definitely stood out though in all of those.
A lot of ambient I kind of put on almost in the background when I'm at work or reading or whatever, but this is one that I just can't listen to in the background. This one is like, it demands your attention and almost like is totally enthralling. And that's actually something I really like about it, is it's not really, it's not something that maybe you can meditate to it, but it's more something that I feel like benefits from a close listen, which is cool because of how minimalistic it is.
Mm-hmm. So my number 3 is Eyes of Fate by 2 artists, Not Waving and Romance. This is a very obscure album. Like, the most popular song on it, I think, is like 3,000 listens or something on Spotify. I think it is pretty recent to Spotify, though. I found it on YouTube. Yeah, it's another ambient album. This one is kind of like what you described, Clara, which is very interesting to me. It feels very orchestral, very emotive throughout this entire album. Every song has its own kind of distinct quirks and qualities and ideas, and I feel like they're fleshed out really well. All of these songs are just, whenever I'm listening to them, I like forget them when I'm outside of the album too. It's one of those albums where it's like there's this distinct nostalgia to even thinking about the album, but especially when you like on re-listens, I'm like, oh, this song, I love this song, and the next song comes around, I'm like, oh, I love this song. Like a really weird nostalgia that comes along with every listen. It only builds, which is just strange. Like, I've only listened to this album maybe 6 or 7 times, and yet like every time it's like, this, like, I'm just more excited about it while listening to it, which is not something I've had for many other albums. It starts really dark and really like brooding and almost spooky going in, but as it kind of goes through, it gets mellowed out. It gets a lot more touching and intimate, and by the end, it just leaves you like wanting more.
All right, so my number 3 is one that you, I guess, didn't care for too much, although you did listen to. But I just, every listen, started to love more and more, and that is the new Billie Eilish record, Happier Than Ever. I liked her debut album, which was, oh, what's the title? It's really long. It's like, When We All Fall Asleep, Where Do We Go? Now, obviously, it was a big hit. That album had like the song Bad Guy and whatever. I found that album was fine.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of a low-key bedroom pop, self-produced type of project.
A very dark, grimy sound to it.
Yeah, like, it was cool. Yeah. I don't think it stood out too much, other than a couple of the big songs. But I was interested to see where she would go with her music, and then she released that one track, Everything I Ever Wanted, which is like a little, track I think released a few months after the album, which really caught my attention. I like that sound even more than on the album, and I was really excited for her new stuff. And when Happier Than Ever dropped, I actually didn't listen to it when it came out because I think I was just busy. It was earlier in the year, and eventually I got to it, and I'm so glad I did because it's great. It's a more mature kind of, I guess, like development of her music sound, where she had kind of a lot of the same, I'd say, like motifs on her first album. Like, not like the songs all sounded the same, but they all were in the same similar style. And this album like actually has a clear evolution even throughout its track list. The kind of bedroom pop with her kind of like whispering vocals on top that almost evolved into slightly a little more higher energy, more danceable tracks, some that have a bit more of an edge to them, and then by the end even introducing like alternative rock indie influences, where she has like guitars, like loud like electric guitars kind of coming. So some really cool shifts in style, interesting kind of like gradual evolution even throughout this album, but also compared to her debut, I think a pretty good leap forward.
Yeah.
And something else I liked about this album is that despite the 16-track runtime, which I think some people might consider to be a bit too long, I think that every track is really good and it earns its place on the album. And so I never feel bored, even though the album is almost an hour long. So I appreciate that too. So
I definitely did get the sense that this album was, for one, more mature. The sound is more matured. But I also got the sense that it was overall more equal than the previous albums.
Yes.
Like, I did like some of the songs on the previous album more than I liked like any of the songs on this album, but fewer of them. This album was definitely more consistent, which I can respect.
Yeah, I think it's a really good album for her, and I feel like her next album could be even better. So that's my number 3. But we'll go on to our number 2.
My number 2 is Fever Dreams by Villagers. This album kind of crossroads two of my favorite genres, especially like two of my favorite modern genres, because there are a lot of genres that like were old, like prog rock, for example. There is modern prog rock, but I find it pretty hit or miss. Like old prog rock
from the 70s.
From the 70s is just excellent. It's kind of like that, but I feel like right now there's a golden age for these two genres. One is psychedelia, or like psychedelic rock, neo-psychedelic rock, and then the other is indie folk, which is kind of like folk rock, which both of these genres are really big right now. You have Grizzly Bear, Fleet Foxes, The Antlers on the one hand, and then for the neo-psychedelia, you have King Gizzard, Tame Impala, Pond. The list goes on and on for that one. This album, really is the nice middle ground for both of those, taking the best elements from both genres, taking the intimacy from folk with like the exuberant ambient energy of psychedelic rock, and it just mixes them really nicely, bringing in even elements that remind me of like Pink Floyd.
So now my number 2 is an album that initially I didn't like really care for too much. When I first heard it, I was like, meh, okay, that's fine. But then when I returned to it a month or so later, I just fell in love with it, and I listened to it like nonstop for about a week and a half. So that time just has kind of cemented it as an album that needs to be on this list for me. So that album is Blue Weekend by Wolf Alice. So Wolf Alice, they've been around for a bit, but I actually had not really heard of them until this year with this album, because this album got a lot of hype. But when I saw the album cover for Blue Weekend, I thought of Twin Peaks. I was like, oh, is this going to be one of those bands that they would have had in the Roadhouse at the end of each episode of The Return, playing kind of an indie rock, dream pop, alternative type of song to almost harken back to Julie Cruz and her band in the original Twin Peaks show. Because I love the vibe of that whole, I don't know, the whole Roadhouse like atmosphere and the sequences that they have there where they have these bands show, the lighting, everything like that. I don't know. It's such an iconic part of that series, and I always liked the music that they had there too. In the show, I mean, they had Chromatics and they had Sharon Van Etten and other similar bands, and I feel like Wolf Alice would actually fit in right there. And so not just by the album cover there, the actual music as well. So when I listened to the album, I was like, oh, that's cool. But beyond that, I didn't really get into it much until I returned to it. And that's when some of the songs really stood out to me, like How I Make It Okay, or Lipstick on the Glass, or Smile, or Last Man on the Earth. Like all these songs like really have just stuck with me. And I just love the sound. I like how it almost sounds a little bit like old, 90s shoegaze at times, like bands like Slowdive, but also has a very modern alternative rock sound to it as well. And female vocalist who's really, really stellar on every track. So definitely one of my favorite albums of the year, one that I'll be turning to a lot, I'm sure, next year. So
yeah, this is one of those albums that I listened to it once and didn't really care for it, so I guess I've yet to return to it like you did.
Yeah, like it might take a few listens, or you just might not ever care for it, and that's fine too. But so before we go to our number ones, I think we're going to talk about honorable mentions. There's definitely some albums that we wanted to include in the top 5 that we just couldn't. So why don't you start with yours?
Yeah, so I have 2 big ones. One is the Abel Mogart album that you mentioned. The second is A Tiny House in Secret Speeches, Polar Equals by Sweet Trip. I listened to the other one by Sweet Trip, the popular one,
Velocity, Design, Comfort.
Yeah. And that was a really good album. So I was like, oh, I'm excited to come back if they're releasing new stuff. And I felt like this album was a lot more in the dream pop direction, though it still had like IDM elements in it. But I just found like the songs were really fun, really light, really easy listen, and I just keep finding myself coming back to these songs. So I had to include it somewhere on this list, even if it wasn't quite as good as some of the other ones.
Yeah, for me, I have a few I want to mention. 2 of them actually I have here on vinyl. If you could hand me that one. So, the latest album by Black Midi, Cavalcade, they're kind of a newer band, I guess, that's just started in 2019. But their first album, Schlagenheim, was like a kind of a post-punk, post-rock album with some math rock elements, and almost industrial elements at times. It was really good. And this album it's not really like that at all anymore. It's almost like a I don't know, like a Lizard era King Crimson album.
Wow.
So it's got really experimental like jazz influence, and while still kind of continuing with their like post-punk sound. So really cool. And the most like trippy album cover. We didn't actually know which way it was supposed to go.
Yeah.
It doesn't help that the gatefold opens like vertically. Anyway, the next album that I have here on vinyl that was a favorite of mine from earlier this year was the new St. Vincent project, Daddy's Home. This was, as we're talking about throwbacks, and also talking about throwbacks to the 70s and Pink Floyd. This album is very Pink Floyd influenced, very like late 60s, early 70s psych rock influenced. She learned how to play the sitar for this album. She includes backing vocals that are not just her voice overdubbed. It's like actual other singers to emulate the sound of like Dark Side of the Moon a little bit. She even plays some guitar solos that sound like David Gilmour. It's a fun album and a really cool, not only just a good throwback album, but like just a good album in its own right. So those 2 for sure I wanted to bring up since I just have them on vinyl. But just a couple others that I want to mention. The new Lingua Ignota album, Sinner Get Ready, kind of a industrial sounding, classical singer-songwriter album. Although this album does tone down a bit more of the industrial elements that she usually has in favor of just more very emotional orchestral and vocal tracks that are just really blow you away. And then another album is the new Tyler the Creator project, Call Me If You Get Lost. Just a kind of return to hip hop for him, and an amazing album that really impresses even after Igor, which was kind of, I think, what many people thought would be his peak. And then the last album I have to mention is Clara by Lasso. Like I really love that one too. But yeah, without further ado, we'll go to our number 1 of the year. So we'll start with you. What was your number 1 of the year?
It was already mentioned, and it's the new Silk Sonic album. This album calls back to one of my favorite periods in music. I feel like the energy of the 70s with funk and fusion and prog rock, all of these like genres that were really big in the 70s just have the same energy, the same like liveliness that I feel like died after the 70s. Like we still haven't really gotten that back. And it was really refreshing and nice to see that energy kind of come back with the 2021 album. And I listened to this album going to campus for university while like on the train, and then every time I'd like coming home I'd be like, well, it's been stuck in my head since I listened to it coming here, so I have to listen to it again. So I'd listen to it over a span of a month, like since the first day I listened to it until like maybe a month later. I'd probably listen to it like 10 times, just going back and forth. It was really nice. Really good album.
It's every track is an earworm, that's for sure. I actually wanted to bring up, just since we both had it on our list, what were some of your favorite tracks on Silk Sonic?
I've had a different favorite track on that album pretty much each time I've listened to it. A different song has stood out. At this point, there has been no song on that album that has not stood out to me as my favorite track at some point.
Just cycles through every time.
Yeah, I really can't choose a favorite track.
Okay, fair enough. What's your favorite right now?
Blast Off has been really sticking with me lately. 777 is just, the energy of it is something that like I keep coming back to. Those would be the big ones for me.
Yeah, 777 is a short one, but it's like a real banger.
Yeah.
I always love like the kind of first real track after the intro. Leave the Door Open, super good. Put on a Smile is like a really emotional kind of like cathartic song.
Very.
Yeah, those are probably my two at the moment. So my number one album of the year is kind of in the same vein as the whole, is what I was talking about, Black Midi, although more like their first album, and that is Squid's Bright Green Field, which I have here on vinyl. This album was really impressive. I did not expect it to be as good as it was going into it. Another band from Brighton. And yeah, this album, it's so chaotic at times. The singer's voice is so manic and like insane, and the music around him is like chaotic and twisted and unpredictable. It's really like math rock and post-punk at its best, and it bears some inspiration from like bands like Slint, with the kind of the song structures being so wacky, and like a lot of it being based on like rock grooves, but it also has like influence from Modest Mouse and kind of just like the chaos that that a lot of the tracks have, especially as they progress and just get like bizarre by the end. You have tracks like the 8.5-minute narrator that becomes like a horror show by the end. Tracks like Boy Racers, which starts out as like this like really intense rock groove and then drips off into like just complete ambience. And other really standout tracks like Paddling or Pamphlets or Documentary Filmmaker about some person that's like trapped in a hospital ward and just experiencing the world based on people's conversations. Really interesting stuff. And so this album is like, very experimental, very cutting edge, and I hope that this is kind of the direction that rock goes in this decade, because it's very exciting. So lastly, I think we're just going to talk about a bit where we're going to go with this channel. So while this video is kind of just about 2021, the next video won't just be about 2022. We'll probably pick a random year. We listen to a lot of music from the late 60s to now, anything in between. And so we're just going to basically pick a year, and we're going to talk about 5 albums each from that year. So if you want us particularly like to go into a certain year that you think is a good year for music, you can put that in the comments below, and we'll consider that. Otherwise, we'll just kind of pick one. So
there are quite a few we want to do. A lot of them are probably 2010s and later that we've planned so far, but we want to get some wacky ones like 1977 and stuff.
Sure. Yeah.
Just ones that you wouldn't necessarily think about.
There's some years where it's like, okay, sure, we probably should do those because there's some notable big albums to talk about. But it might also be fun to like pick some year that maybe was a bit of a weird year for music. You know? Like I don't know. At least for me, the 80s is a bit of a dry period. So once we get into the 80s, I think I'll be listening to a lot of new music that I just haven't heard before.
I like the 80s, so I could show you a fair bit, but we should also diverge a lot, have different collections of music. But I did a challenge over this entire last year of listening to 1,000 albums I've never listened to before, just to kind of stretch my music, and like from a wide range of genres too. just to keep things novel during the pandemic. And so I have lots of stuff to choose from, but I'm still expanding. Like all it did was just expand my mind to just how much I don't know and how much music there is to listen to.
Well, I think that this exploration to different years will probably expose us to a lot of music we haven't heard before, and kind of force us to like evaluate, okay, like what kind of were the trends, and we can maybe after we do a couple of these videos kind of figure out like just by what we listen to how music has changed over the years. So I think not only will it be fun, but also be educational. Yeah. Thanks for watching, and hope to see you next time for another year.
Yeah, and be sure to leave comments so that we get seen by the algorithm.
That's right.
Because we might be able to catch on, maybe. We'll see.
We're probably not.
We can try.